kind of the end of the Roman Republic. And it really goes into detail concerning what was happening before the Roman Empire officially fell. And so it's a good one. I'm not too far into it, but people have asked him, well, where are we exactly when comparing the United States with the Roman Empire? And we're in the area of the Caesars, right about where the New Testament is. That's where we would be found.
Now, Rome, the complete fall of Rome was in
476.
76.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
So you're saying we got how many more years until we're done?
Well, I don't think we're going to have a 1,000-year reign of this country.
okay. Oh, come on,
Before some other country comes in and takes us over.
Well,
Yeah.
we're doing a pretty good job on ourselves right now. I've got a preacher in Denver who's had to pull his son out of one of the prestige high schools, well, Devlin, if any of you know anything about Devlin, because the language that he hears all the time in the hallways just grates on him. Everybody uses the F word freely in the hallways of the school. And he's in band, and in band, he's surrounded by transgender kids. And he's a fine Christian boy, and so they pulled him out. He's going to be homeschooled. That's where we're going. So. Okay, in chapter 5, we're getting real close to the difficult part of Daniel. All this historical happening is really not too difficult to understand. When we get beyond chapter 5, get into chapter 6, it gets a little bit more difficult. But this is Belshazzar. Belshazzar is the son of a king by the name of Nabonidus. Nabonidus is known by historians. There's no problem. Belshazzar, however, was not noted until more recent times as being a real person. And so liberal scholarship just really went wild on Belshazzar and said there is no such person. And then all of a sudden they found some records of Belshazzar. So you know the retractions in the newspaper. You've got a huge font on the front page of the banner headline. But if it's wrong, it appears in real small script on the back of the newspaper. I guess that's just being a human being. But Belshazzar is a real person. We have all sorts of information these days concerning Belshazzar. I'm just trying to think where I had it just the other day because I was teaching at Bear Valley, teaching the book of Daniel. And I get a writing called Biblical Archaeological Review, which is a great magazine on biblical history and archaeology. And it's not put out by members of the church, but it's a very well put together piece. And the other day they said, we'd like to have you back. Could you spare $5 for a full year subscription? And it went off to them real quick. You bet I could spend $5 for a subscription. See if I can find that. Okay, there, I found it. So the Nabonidus is noted in history books, no doubt about Nabonidus, the father of Belshazzar. It's just that Belshazzar was not noted. And he is the one, he's going to be the last king. And the problem is that they don't want to call him king. But in 1854, British consul named J.G. Taylor explored some ruins in southern Iraq on behalf of the British Museum. If you ever go to London, if you're ever there, make sure you go to the British Museum. I've been to Smithsonian, I've been to museums in Italy and Greece, and I've been to the British Museum 2 times now, and been to the Smithsonian a number of times. And I really do believe the British Museum just outshines every other museum in the world. I was with a teacher from Bear Valley. We were looking at, he was looking at some manuscripts, and he wanted to get a better view of the manuscripts. The guard was standing over here behind me, and it was Warren Wilcox. And so Warren pulled a ladder over. I don't know what he was thinking. Pulled a ladder over to look down with his camera onto a glass case to get a picture of the manuscript. I saw the guard start walking toward him. And the guard waited until he took the picture and came down off the ladder, and he said, "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't allow you to do that." I thought that was great, you know. But anyway, Warren's overlooking a manuscript, and I'm off someplace else, and I find the Rosetta Stone. I don't know if any of you know what the Rosetta Stone is, but at this time the Rosetta Stone was just sitting there, and I just had to do the silly thing. I had to touch it. And so I touched the Rosetta Stone. I went back to Warren and I said, "Warren, I just found the Rosetta Stone and I touched it." And he said, "Where is it?" So he got his fingerprint on it, just like I got my fingerprint on it. But it's British Museum. It's a great museum. A British consul explored some ruins in southern Iraq on behalf of the British Museum. He dug into a great mud brick tower that was part of a temple of the moon god that dominated the city. Taylor found several small clay cylinders buried in the brickwork, each about 4 inches long, inscribed with 60 or so lines of cuneiform writing. When Taylor took the cylinders back to Baghdad, he showed them to his colleagues. Fortunately, his senior colleague was Sir Henry Rawlinson, who was one of those who had deciphered the Babylonian cuneiform script. Rawlinson was able to read the writing on the clay cylinders. The inscriptions had been written at the command of Nabonidus, there's the father's name, king of Babylon from 555 to 539. The king had repaired the temple tower, and the clay cylinders commemorated that fact. The inscriptions proved that the ruined tower was the temple of the city of Ur. Remember where Abram is from? Ur of the Chaldees? He's a Chaldean. He's not Jewish. The Jews come along later on when they come out of Egypt. So he's a Chaldean. The words were a prayer for long life and good health of Nabonidus and for his eldest son. The name of that son, clearly written, was Belshazzar. So it wasn't until 1854 that liberal scholarship even said, "Oh, our mistake." Well, they probably didn't say that. There really is somebody named Belshazzar. But finding Belshazzar as king has eluded archaeologists for a long period of time. But they found some other writings that are not dealing with the Babylonian writings, where in one language, and these are just like a number of writings like the Rosetta Stone, where you have the same thing written in 3 different languages. Well, written in 2 different languages, is a manuscript that they found. And they found that in one language, an individual is called king, but in the other language, he's just called prince. And so that's the idea that for some people, Belshazzar was called king, and so the scripture refers to him as king. But in other languages, he'd just be referred to as prince. And so it's just a matter of which language you're looking at as to whether he would be noted as king or not. So when you're looking at Daniel 5, it says Belshazzar the king. And so we accept that he's referred to as the king. Held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels, which Nebuchadnezzar his father. Now you may find in your side notes where it says father, that it has a side note in it. It refers to forefather. Well, actually, it would be Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar would be his grandfather. His grandfather had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, in order that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Big mistake. They brought the gold vessels which had been taken out of the temple, the house of God which is in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, the wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold. Oh, you're compounding the problem. And silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a man emerged. And here we have the artist's conception. And you'll notice that there's a menorah right there. Would be a lampstand that they would have taken. That's very Jewish. And then a plastered wall. This area has been dug into by archaeologists, and they have found sections of plastered wall. They haven't found any handwriting on the wall, but they found sections of plastered wall, right exactly where some of this would have taken place. Began writing opposite the lampstand and the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Then the king's face grew pale, his thoughts alarmed him, his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. I usually stop right there because I have students who are just starting out in the preaching profession, and I say to them, does this sound familiar to you?
Yes, it did.
I think everybody who preaches or speaks publicly has gone through some of this. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription, explain its interpretation to me, will be clothed with purple, have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. Well, and the reason he says third ruler is because he's only the second ruler. He referred to as king, but his father is the real king. Nabonidus is the king, and he is taking over for father while father's off gallivanting around the country building idolatrous temples. And all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler. His nobles were perplexed. He's about to pass out. The queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. The queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. This is more likely the queen mother. This is more likely his mother because of the way she's talking to him. She's getting him straightened out. It's very motherly type advice that he's being given. So this is the wife of Nabonidus. This is the mother of Belshazzar who is speaking. There's a man in your kingdom. Now she's actually the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. And so probably as a young woman or little girl, She was around when Daniel was around Nebuchadnezzar at that earlier time. And so she's talking like someone who has experience. There's a man in your kingdom. She's speaking from first-hand experience. And he's listening to her. In whom is the spirit of the holy gods in the days of your father, your grandfather. Illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, again, grandfather, your grandfather, the king, or your father, that would be Nabonidus, the king appointed him, no, that's still Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams. I mean, she knows the whole thing. Explanation of enigmas and solving of difficult problems were found in Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now I've heard about you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in, and so he says they couldn't figure it out, and so he notes down here, these are words that are interpreted within the text. Verse 24, then the hand was sent from him, and this inscription was written out, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene means God has numbered your kingdom. And repeating of a single number intensifies the power of the number. That's why when you're looking at the number 10 being complete, if you want a number of total completion, you multiply it by 10 by 10 by 10, you get your 1,000. So the 1,000-year reign that is found in the Revelation refers to a reign that is absolutely complete, but it's not referring to a literal. It's not looking to the numerical value, it's looking to the figurative value of the number 10 intensified. So 10 times 10 times 10 will be the intensity of the number 10. Here it is, the word is used twice. God has numbered your kingdom, in case you didn't understand. God has numbered your kingdom, it's repeated. Tekel, you have been weighed out in the scales and found deficient. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Well, that's pretty easy to understand, but they just didn't understand what that writing meant. So then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple, put a necklace of gold around his neck, issued a proclamation concerning him, and he now had authority as third ruler in the kingdom. That same night, and this may be why Daniel said, really don't do this for me. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain, and Darius the Mede. Now, Darius the Mede is a fellow that we have not yet found any information on. We know who the governor was. He was a governor by the name of Gubaru, but we don't pick up Darius the Mede. The Medes were a people who fought on the winning side. When the Babylonians took over the Assyrian Empire, the Assyrians, remember, their last capital city, there were 3 capital cities, if you're looking at the writing of Jonah. There's 3 capital cities, and Jonah is told to go to Nineveh, which is not yet a capital city when Jonah goes there, but it will be a capital city. It's the last holdout of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian forces, with the last king of Assyria, leave Nineveh and flee across to Haran. And you may have remembered Haran from the time of Abraham and Sarai, Abram and Sarai, coming across that Fertile Crescent area geographically to go down into a land that they'd never seen or never even heard of before. Based on faith, they just win. And then they held out in Haran for a little while as the Babylonians chased them down. And the Babylonians had the Medes on their side. And the Median people are a people who are geographically located north of Iran or north of Persia, and they fought on the winning side. And so when the Persians got all built up and they're about to take down the Babylonian Empire, all of a sudden the Medes switched over to the Persian side. So you got Medo-Persian, but actually they had fought on the side of the Babylonians against the Assyrians. And they went all the way over to, they finally got the Assyrians holed up at a place called Carchemish. Carchemish is the northernmost border area of the Promised Land. It's now Turkey. And it's a military fortress in Turkey right now. So archaeologists can't get in there very easily to do any work. But Carchemish is where they hold up the Assyrian army. And this is about 712, 714 BC. And the Assyrians send a courier out. He goes all the way down to Egypt to try to get Egypt to come up and break the siege. And the Egyptian ruler at that time is a fellow called, left me, just a minute, let me think about Anyway, he comes up with an Egyptian force to break the siege so that the Assyrians can get out of there. And as he comes up, he runs into Josiah, who is one of the youngest kings of Judah that ever existed, and was one of the finest, if not the finest king of Judah. He's a young man. He started his work at the age of 8, and just a real fantastic king. And they meet at Megiddo, which is a place, a plains area, and the Egyptians are running chariots, and horses are very fragile in those days, because the horseshoe hadn't been invented yet. And so since the horseshoe hadn't been invented yet, you don't run them over rocky ground. You pick your ground. And so they've come up with chariots, and they meet at Megiddo. Megiddo's a good place. And the Egyptian ruler, and I'll think of his name in a minute, the Egyptian ruler tells Josiah, God sent me up to Carchemish. He sent me up there to do his will. And of course, being a Jew, being a very nationalistic Jew, he doesn't believe for a minute that a Gentile would be in contact with God. But the inspired writer says, it's true. It's true. God had spoken to this Egyptian ruler, and he told him to go up there. They fight a battle, and that's the eventual end of the Assyrian Empire. They die in place right there at Carchemish. But anyway, going back, and that's the Medes and the Persians, and so he says this night. So Darius the Mede, going back to Daniel 5:31, Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about Pharaoh Necho. That's his name. Pharaoh Necho. Just popped into my mind. Pharaoh Necho. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. And Darius the Mede is really working with the Persians. The Medes have switched sides. So this is a part of Medo. But so we don't have his name found yet, but probably will. That's about 539 BC. So that's the handwriting on the wall. And then there's the distressed king and the discerning prophet and the defeated kingdom and the dead king. Now, we understand from the history books that when the Persians got into Babylon, they virtually walked into the city of Babylon. There was a great feast that was being held. We just read about it. There was a great feast that was being held. This is the history books outside the Bible. and they just nearly walked past the guards who were sleeping, and there was very little bloodshed, and that was the end of the Babylonian Empire, just that quick. So Belshazzar is the last king. There's a little bit more in the history books about Nabonidus. So we come down to Daniel in the den of lions. And so Daniel becomes very friendly with this individual who is Darius the Mede. Now you have to keep in mind that the name Darius is a very popular name among the Persians. And that finally when the Persian Empire is destroyed, when the Persian Empire is completely wiped out, it's a result of Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great, you remember, is from Macedon, which is was at that time northern Greece, and the Greeks always considered them to be pretty country people, not as sophisticated as people living in Athens. And so Alexander proved them all wrong, a tremendously brilliant tactician, and goes all the way over to India, nearly gets himself killed in India when he and his right-hand man scale a fortress wall, jump down into the courtyard with their swords drawn, expecting that all his army would be right behind him, and they're all by themselves facing these guys. And he gets a wound in the chest and deflates one of his lungs, and he nearly dies from that. And so he was a brilliant tactician, but he wasn't too smart when he did that. I was working with some military members of the church overseas, and working with some guys who were in special forces. I mean, just teaching classes. And these two guys went out with grappling hooks one night, and they knew where there was a castle, and they believed the castle was vacant, and so they're just going to scale the wall just for the practice. And so they throw the ropes up over those grappling hooks, catch, they go up, they drop down the courtyard and run right into two Doberman pinschers. They beat a hasty retreat. And I think that's what happened to Alexander. He just was too eager to lead his troops, and nearly paid with his life. But he died at a very early age in any case. And we're not sure exactly what he died from. It might have been from wounds like that. So Daniel is really friendly with this Darius the Mede. What I was going to say, that there were a number of Dariuses that ruled the Persian kingdom, and I believe it's Darius III that Alexander finally defeats in battle. So you have to watch out for the name Darius. And Darius is also, Darius the First is in the Greek line, because when you're looking at the number of kings that are found in, and eventually ending up in chapter 11 of the book of Daniel, you'll find a number of names that pop up like Darius. And the Ptolemy line that goes into Egypt, the Ptolemaic line, ends up with a woman as the final ruler, and I bet you all know who it is. She's a Greek. Now that's going to throw you off. Who would be in Egypt at the time of the rise of the Roman Empire as a woman ruler of Egypt? Who is it? Antony and Cleopatra. It's Cleopatra. And we don't know if she's Cleopatra the fourth or the fifth, but the Greeks have taken over by that time Egypt. So all of those rulers are really a bunch of Greeks pretending to be Egyptians. And so they dress like Egyptians, they talk like Egyptians. They even had, and Cleopatra, the one who was of Antony and Cleopatra's time, was supposed to marry her brother. There was a lot of brother-sister marriages among the Egyptians at that time, and she just hated him. She tried everything she could think of to do him in. And she didn't go along with that particular custom of the Egyptians, but in every other way she made herself look like and talk like and act like an Egyptian. But the Egyptians were gone by that time, by the time the Romans take over. Anyway, getting back to Darius. Looking at chapter 6, seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps. The word satrap is the word Shah. Shah. You remember the rulers of Iran before the Muslims came along? The Shah of Iran. That's where that word comes from. The word Shah is derived from satraps. Over the kingdom, they should be in charge of the whole kingdom. Over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps, because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Oh, jealousy. That's what's going to happen. And the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was found in him. I'll bet they had a whole big long list of a line of listings of corruption, but they couldn't find any in him. Then these men said, verse 5, we shall not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. And of course with Daniel, God's law comes first. And that's the way it ought to be with us. If we want to take a page out of the book of Daniel, that we need to put God first. God's law comes first. And if there's any law that is designed by man that's contrary to God's law, we can't obey it. So God's law comes first. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement. They were conspiring right there to the king, and spoke to him as follows: King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials, and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. And that's an injunction right there in verse 8, and put in written form. It becomes a document, so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. So once it's put in place, it can't be revoked. And it's going to take place no matter what. And you're looking at the book of Esther, and you see the document that goes out to kill all the Jews by Haman. The Jews are going to eventually be able to defend themselves, and that takes care of the problem. But the document could not be revoked because it had the same kind of law among the Persians with Xerxes or Ahasuerus in the book of Esther, that just like this, that it can't be revoked. It's just a peculiarity of the law. Therefore King Darius signed the document, that is the injunction. Now when Daniel knew the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. Now remember, when you're looking at housing, back in those days, you're not looking at plate glass. Plate glass hadn't been invented yet. So I always have to go back and say, let's note the historical context. And the historical context is that this is wrong because this hasn't been invented yet. I was watching a TV series by Kelsey Grammer the other night about battles of America's history, and noting the Revolutionary War. In the Revolutionary War, cannon are firing at each other, but they've got cannonballs exploding. No, sorry, that didn't happen during the Revolutionary War. Those are cannonballs, or solid cannonballs, and they just break things down. When you're at sea and you're fighting against another ship, you try to get his rigging, knock his rigging down so that he's helpless and can't move because he's under sail, but you don't have any exploding shot. You may have a shot that is a shot that splits up and has solid shot that is in pieces or something like that. But there's no but sure enough, in that series, because it's TV and because Hollywood's mixed in there with it, you got exploding cannonballs. Now, if you're in the Civil War or the war of Northern Aggression, however you want to look at it, you've got exploding cannonballs, but not then. So there are things that take place that we think of that really aren't quite as accurate. But here's the document, and there's no plate glass, so he's not behind a window. When it says he had windows open toward Jerusalem, this would be shuttered openings. And so he's opened the shutters where people can see him, what he's doing. If he was behind plate glass, they might not have seen him, but there is no plate glass, so that's a moot point. Then the men came by agreement, found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days to be cast into the lion's den? The king answered and said, the statement is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which it may not be revoked. Well, he doesn't think a thing about it. What could possibly go wrong? We say that all the time. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. Then as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed, set his mind on delivering Daniel. There's an indication he and Daniel are good friends, and he has no choice. He kept exerting himself to rescue him, even until sunset, in verse 14. Then the men came by agreement. That's the conspiracy right there, verse 15. To the king, and said to the king, this is why they designed this whole document, to get rid of Daniel. Everybody's trying to kill off the Jewish folks. You'd almost get the impression that there are people throughout history trying to get rid of the Jewish folks. Of course there is. Our little paper hanger, a corporal from World War I by the name of Adolf Schlickengruber, tried to do it and was successful in many ways, sadly. Then the king rose with the dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. So he goes into the lion's den. And when he had come near to the den to Daniel, verse 20, he cried out with a troubled voice. A troubled voice. See there, he does not want Daniel done in. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, as your God whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions. Then Daniel spoke to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. They have not harmed me, inasmuch as I found innocent before him. Also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. And so, again, we see God's law takes precedence over man's law. Then the king was very pleased, gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den. No injury was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accuse. There's the conspiracy right there. Maliciously accuse Daniel, and they cast them and their children and their wives into the lion's den. People are going to have, when you teach that, going to have problem with that. All the scripture is doing is relating it, whether it's good or bad, making no particular judgment concerning the rightness or wrongness of the activity. If God, and I just want you to note this, if God were to put in, every time someone sinned, were to put in a statement concerning they shouldn't have done this, you would have to have a forklift to take your Bible to Bible class. God just does not do that, and it's understandable because he's already noted it one time. There's no need for him to repeat it over and over again. Now I know that Jewish education is by rote, and it's by rote primarily because you don't have books, you don't have writing material, you don't have that which would be available to the masses. Gutenberg is not around yet to invent the printing press. That's a later invention. So you teach by rote, and what you do is you've got the material, you've got the scripture, and you read it, and they repeat it. You read it, they repeat it. You read it, they repeat it. Over and over and over again, and that's education by rote. And it worked, because those folks really knew their scripture very, very well. And here we've got it. How many Bibles do we have in our house? 3.5, 4 Bibles, maybe even more Bibles than that. And we're not as well versed as were the Jewish community as far as the Word of God is concerned. So anyway, they bring Daniel up, and they cast the men and their children and their wives into the lion's den. They had not reached the bottom of the den, verse 24, before the lions overpowered and crushed all their bones. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in the land, "May your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. His dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we come down to chapter 7, and in chapter 7 we're going to have a real close connection with the book of Revelation. And we're not going to be able to get into all of that. There's an artist's depiction of Daniel in the lion's den. We have no idea what it would actually be like. Sometimes we say, well, I bet it was a smelly place. You know, people in that period of time, smells really didn't bother them like we think we would be bothered. The average house in the land of Canaan, when Joshua takes the people in, is a house that has been built by the Canaanites being the whole body of people living in the land before the Jews come in under the leadership of Moses over on the east side of the Jordan, and Joshua on the west side of the Jordan. And so when they come in and they take the houses, it's like the table's already set and there's food on the table. They just take everything over, and they will continue. They're not in the architectural house building mode. They just take over what works for those people. And so what you see among the Canaanites in housing is going to be what you see among the Jews in housing. And the housing is very simple. It is primarily stucco type manufacture with lots of tree branches and lots of leaves and walls of stucco, and inside the stucco would be all sorts of branches and everything. And it's all hardened by the sun, and that's a very successful type of building. But at ground level is where you keep all your animals. And you live in the second level. And we'd say, man, I bet that's smelly. It wouldn't be smelly to them, because any of you who have certainly worked around animals and everything, that smell is many times the smell of money. That's what farming is all about. And those people were either pastoral or agricultural. You got three groupings, either pastoral, agriculture, or industrial. Well, industrial age doesn't come along until metallurgy allows it to come along. Prior to that, it's all primarily Bronze Age, some into the age of steel, and then the working with steel to the point where it would withstand pressure, and the Greeks knew about steam and how steam could be harnessed in some way, but they didn't have the metallurgy to do it. It just wasn't there yet. They hadn't worked all that out. And so here you have farmers, and they're agricultural. The book of Ruth shows us very much in how an agricultural system works, where people live in town and they farm outside of town. But the smell is the smell of the farmyard, and that just doesn't bother people who are used to it, and that's just a part of life. So I think it's city folks that usually say, ooh, wouldn't that smell be? Well, for you, probably, but not for those people. So looking in chapter 7, it says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw. Now, we just left chapter 6 where Belshazzar's dead. So this again is done topically rather than chronologically, because now we're jumping back in time. It's in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down, related the following summary of it. I had a teacher, I went to Sunset School preaching in Lubbock before I got into the university system and got my undergrad and my graduate degree. But I had a teacher at Sunset, and he said, I keep waking up in the middle of the night, and I'm dreaming about a sermon it's got to be one of the greatest sermons around. He said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pad of paper and a pencil, and I'm going to put it on the nightstand right beside me. And when I first wake up in the morning, or during the night, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to write down that sermon, and it's going to be great. He came in the next day and he said, well, I did that, and I couldn't read it. He said, I have no idea what that dream was about. But it was a good one. I don't know what it was about. So here it is. Here's Daniel. He writes the dream down, and he's got it. He writes the dream down. And I was looking in my vision by night, and I saw, behold, the four winds of heaven. 4 is man's number. So when we get into Revelation, we'll find more about the 4. 4 is man's number, and it carries with it the idea of like north, south, east, west, 4. 4 walls to a building. That's man's number. Some have thought that it's a combination. No, that would be the number 7. The number 7, man's number and God's number. 4 plus 3, 7. But just 4 being man's number, and stirring up the great sea. Now the great sea right there, if you mark in Revelation 17, verse 1, verse 15, is the sea of humanity. So we looked out over the crowd, and it was like a undulating sea of humanity. And that's the idea when it says stirring up the great sea, the sea of humanity. And 4 great beasts were coming up from the sea. Now you're getting into a lot of the symbolism that is very prominent in the Revelation. 4 great beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion in verse 4. And verse 5, a second one. Verse 6, another one. And then verse 7, a fourth. Now, as you look at this, the Babylonian Empire would be represented by the lion. They had the wings of an eagle, kept looking till those wings were plucked, it was lifted up from the ground, made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a human mind was given to it. That's Babylonian, and that would be from 605 to 539. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear, was raised up on one side, 3 ribs, don't have any idea what that is, in his mouth and his teeth, and thus I said to it, arise, devour my cheek. Well, the second beast is going to be the Persian, or the Medo-Persian Empire, from 539 to 331. After this I kept looking, number 6, verse 6, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads. Remember, just 4 kings. Alexander's kingdom went to 4 generals, went to 5 originally, ended up with 4. And so this is the 4 wings of a bird. Beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given. That's Greek, that's Alexander. And that's going to be really from 336 to 323. And then it'll be divided at 323 when Alexander's gone, and that will last from 323 to 168. Then verse 7, after I kept looking in night vision, behold, a 4th beast. This is going to be the Roman Empire. 4th beast, dreadful and terrifying, extremely silent. And look at, when you're looking at this, look at how much wording is noted concerning the Roman kingdom. Now I started out this morning by saying, we always talk about the period of silence of God between the testaments. Well, here's the material that fills it in. The material, we've looked at the Babylonian Empire, we've looked at the Medo-Persian Empire, we're going to be looking at the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. But look at, going back to Daniel 2, how much time is spent just with the Roman Empire. Because it's during the Roman Empire that Christianity has its birth. And that's all being emphasized here in the book of Daniel. So Daniel is being presented with material. He really doesn't know what any of this means. There's no indication he knows what any of this means. He's just being given it by God. He's writing it down. And it's for people down the line. And in fact, if you come over here to the latter part of Daniel, looking at Daniel 12, look at Daniel 12 verse 4. It says, but as for you, Daniel, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth and knowledge will increase. And so seal up the book. Now, come down here to verse 9. And he said, go your way, Daniel, for these words are concealed and sealed up until the end time. Now, the reason Daniel is told to seal up this writing is not because you're going to be cursed if you pick up this writing and read it. It just means that this writing for you in Daniel's time doesn't have any meaning. And sometimes there are writings that are found in the Old Testament that have no immediate meaning for the people of the time. Joel 2, verses 28 through 32, is the section that Peter quotes in Acts, the 2nd chapter. But for the people in Joel's time, there's no meaning at all. There's nothing that connects with the people of that time. But it's picked up by Peter, and that's the fulfillment of it. When you're looking at Isaiah 7 and verse 14, behold, a virgin shall conceive. Well, actually, it's behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a child, and he will be called Emmanuel. Well, that has meaning in those verses that follow Isaiah 7. This is a prophecy that's given to the faithless king Ahaz, and so the prophecy has meaning for the king because there's something that's happening at that time. We'd have to go back into Isaiah to note it. We don't have time. But it has meaning then. And then in Matthew 1:23, it's picked up again by Matthew in the gospel account. and it's a direct reference to the coming of the Christ. We say that's a great dual fulfillment prophecy. It is a dual fulfillment prophecy. It has a message for King Ahaz at his time, and it has a message for those who are reading that gospel account in Matthew 1 and verse 23. But originally it was not a dual fulfillment prophecy. When the prophecy was first given, it was just for Ahaz and his time. You have to come all the way down in time to Matthew 1:23 before it becomes a dual fulfillment prophecy. So sometimes prophecies have meaning for the people of the time, and sometimes they don't. And here in this particular case, if you were to pick up the book of Daniel, or the writing of Daniel, you would find that it's a bunch of it is concealed. Now, what it's concealed in doing is that it's focusing on the coming of a fellow by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. And we'll see him in Daniel, the 11th chapter. And Antiochus Epiphanes is the one who comes up after being around C. Papilius Lanus, the Roman envoy, and he's been humiliated, and he's angry, and he brings a pig along with him, and probably had more than one pig along with him. He brings a pig with him, and he sacrifices that pig on the altar of the temple in Jerusalem. And that's the desecration of the temple. And that's really the abomination of desolation that Jesus is talking about when he refers back to Daniel in Matthew 24. So it's all coming together. And what we're looking at, and what I want you to note, is that Daniel is given all sorts of information concerning future events, but really out of his time frame, because he's going to die before all these things take place. And so conceal the writing. And that just means you pick it up and read it, it's not going to have any meaning for you. And that's all right. You can read it if you want to, but it's not going to mean anything. But now we're way past that time, looking back, and we see that there's really an emphasis that God places upon the Roman Empire and what's going to happen in the Roman Empire, and really places an emphasis on a problem of God's faithful children in the persecution of the Roman Empire in the Revelation, and we get a hint of that whole thing right here in the book of Daniel. So it's a great book in being able to do that. We need to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and try to finish up most of this.